Welcome to the Rounds Complete podcast, where we pull back the curtain on what it's like to serve and discuss ways in which we can better support those that did.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rounds Complete. Really appreciate you joining us for this episode and for the last episode. Make sure that you are spreading the word to all your friends. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, wherever you listen to your podcasts, you can find us. So please make sure you subscribe, spread the word, shoot us a note, let us know how we're doing, what do you think we could do better, and what you think we're doing well. We always appreciate a good, solid AAR. So today we have something special. It's our first guest. Our first guest is Wesley Morgan, and we're gonna be chatting with him today about his book, The Hardest Place, and his experiences in Kunar province, Afghanistan, as well as Nuristan province. Before we get started, though, we wanted to start with a thing that we're launching on this episode because it is Thursday, and all Afghanistan veterans know what Thursday is. It's Man Love Thursday, and so Dave and I wanted to share some affirmations about ourselves and each other, just to spread a little man love, you know. So I'll start off. Dave, I appreciate how dedicated and how apt and talented you are putting all this together. I know I'm the pretty face, but I am just following Dave's lead. He's the one that set all this up, really spearheaded the whole thing. He's got a ton of drive. He knows what he wants and he goes after it. And it's just always so inspiring to see. So I appreciate you, buddy.
I appreciate you. It's, I think, I appreciate the fact that you challenged me a bit. Very easy to put emotions and past experiences in a box and just forget that they're there, which is never a very healthy thing to do. I remember, I also appreciate your better half. I remember the day she sat me down and she looked me square in the face and she's like, you have PTSD, right?
Yeah.
And I think she's the first person ever first person ever say that out loud to me. So yeah, I just appreciate you guys always being there.
Yeah.
You're the type of friend that I could not talk to for 3 months, pick up a phone and say, hey, I need you on a flight tomorrow. No questions asked. And yeah.
In a heartbeat.
And Wesley, I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate the dedication that you showed. This is a phenomenal book, and I can't wait to talk some more about it. Before we get started with that, though, something hit me the other day, and Wesley, I'm sure you know about it too, and Dave's had this experience as well, but we've all been sitting around in the field or deployed in a guard shack, a guard tower, a smoke pit, a mortar pit, whatever, just sitting around and hanging out, and you get so bored and you end up having the most insane discussions with people, right? And this experience was brought back to me because I was driving my son home from one of his extracurricular activities, and I picked him up and he got in the car, and the first thing he said to me, he goes, "Dad, would you eat the Pillsbury Doughboy?" And without hesitation, I said yes. Of course, I'm going to eat the Pillsbury Doughboy, right?
He looks delicious, yeah.
He looks delicious. But then that spurred this whole conversation about like, okay, well, what do you think he tastes like, right? Does he taste like a crescent roll? Does he taste like a cinnamon roll? How about this? Do you bake him first, right? Would he be more delicious if you bake him first? Does the torture of going through the oven and the baking process, would that make him more delectable? Is it because he feels pain? Can he feel pain? Is he sentient? If you poke him and he goes like, woohoo, does that make him more delicious the more times you poke him? So we had this
you're giving him what he wants.
I think so, right? I think when you poke him, he's enjoying that, but then does that like release the flavor, But so I just had this crazy, crazy conversation with my son, and it really just took me back to, and it was so fun. I loved it, but it took me back to, those times when you're sitting around in a smoke pit or a guard tower or something, just like bored out of your mind, and you have these discussions. Do you guys remember any of these discussions from your time in Afghanistan or Wesley, Iraq, or anything like that? Any sort of crazy discussions? If not, that's fine, because I asked the question on our Blue Sky account, and I got a great response from somebody. Let me see here.
Dave.
This guy, one of our followers.
I remember. This is not that absurd. I'm sure there is some self censorship always going on when there's a reporter around.
Yeah.
But I remember once hanging out in like a guard tower with some Royal Marines in Sangin in 2010,
Nice.
and they were just really bored, and they were trying to list. There's maybe 4 or 5 of them, and they were trying to list all the superheroes they could think of.
Okay.
It was the kind of thing where, okay, they exhausted their supply like in the first few minutes, but then they had many hours left on their shift.
Yeah.
And it just would turn into silence, and then half an hour later, someone would, another one would pop out, and it silence. And another half hour, somewhere deep in the recesses of someone's mind, they'd think of another one.
It's just quiet, quiet, and then all of a sudden, Blue Marvel.
Yeah. I think the only ones that come to mind, our platoon sergeant, my first platoon sergeant, he was a bit of a legend. So we spent a lot of time sitting around talking about his both perceived and unknown superpowers. Yeah.
Yeah. So a Adrift, who is one of our early Blue Sky followers, I posed the question, right? And he said, what method of time travel is the most realistic? And so I asked him to elaborate, and he said, well, everyone likes to get hung up on vehicles, right? Like the DeLorean or what have you. But I'm always more interested in the end result. Back to the Future's entire story hinges on being able to go around and change stuff. But Slaughterhouse-5 said that time travel could happen, but you couldn't change anything. So if time travel is basically re-experiencing things, wouldn't it just be exaggerated memory? And if that's the case, isn't memory its own form of time travel? And like that blew my mind, right? Like that is such a great like guard tower discussion. I remember having a discussion that was like, hey, because I had read a book where this was a central plot point, you could create an elixir that would essentially keep you young. It was an elixir of life, right? It would keep you young, but you had to like kill people and take their spinal fluid, right, to make this elixir. And I had read this book, this obviously fictional book, this novel, where that was a central plot point. And so I remember sitting on Fob Bostic on the helipads, right, waiting for the resupply birds to come in and kick out their kicker boxes and stuff, and just sitting out there under the stars with another lieutenant and just having this very deep discussion about like the morality of that and whether you would do it and how long it would take you to get caught and all kinds of weird stuff. But we have just the strangest discussions as service members in moments of boredom, and I wanted to honor that, especially because I had that fantastic discussion with my son about eating the Pillsbury Doughboy, and I surprised myself at how quickly I was like, yes, 100% yes, like no hesitation, no remorse. Yes, I'm eating the Pillsbury Doughboy. And it was a lot of fun. So, all right. So, like I said, today's very special. It's the first time we're hosting a guest here on Rounds Complete. We're honored to welcome Wesley Morgan. He's a military affairs reporter who has covered the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq since 2007. He's a native of the Boston area, graduate of Princeton University, and began embedding with combat units as a 19-year-old freelancer, which when I realized that, man, it blew my mind. More recently, Wesley is obviously the author of the book we're talking about today, The Hardest Place, The American Military Adrift in Afghanistan's Pesh Valley. Adrift is a great term for it. His reporting has appeared in such esteemed outlets as The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Politico. You can follow him on Twitter at Wesley Morgan. At Wesley Morgan, right? No, Wesley S. Morgan, excuse me, at Wesley S. Morgan, or on Blue Sky at wesleymorgan.bsky.social, right? So, Wesley, welcome to Rounds Complete.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So, can you tell us a bit about your career, how you got started, how you got into journalism, especially military affairs?
Yeah, so I just grew up as like a war nerd kid reading books about Vietnam. And then, 9/11 happened when I was in eighth grade, and it kind of got more real. Um, so when I got to college, my first thought was, oh, I'll join ROTC, going to go into the Army. But then I had a bizarre opportunity come up after my freshman year in college to go to Iraq for the first time for the summer of 2007, the summer of the surge. Um, and I remember showing up there, and I literally was like doing this for my college newspaper, and it was this strange thing that had come about through David Petraeus, actually, because he was a Princeton alum. And I kind of was like, well, I'm like a kid, they're probably not going to let me out of the green zone. But of course, when I got there, they're just like, well, it's another reporter. Okay, what units do you want to embed with? And I was like, oh, okay.
Wow.
114 Cavalry on Haifa Street, 128 Infantry in West Rashid. Let's do 49 Infantry in Tarmiya, because I kept track of where all these units were and everything. And it was kind of off to the races. Just seeing what life was like for young infantrymen my same age. Running around Iraq during what turned out to be the all-time peak of violence in Iraq. That's that summer of 2007.
Yeah.
It was not obvious at the time that it was going to go down. It just seemed like might just keep going up. I also met real journalists, that trip, and kind of was like, okay, this is who I want to be. These are the people I want to emulate. Guys like Michael Gordon, now with the Wall Street Journal, who wrote books like Cobra 2, The General's War, The End Game, and Greg Jaffe, who just recently joined the New York Times, longtime Washington Post guy, and then Evan Wright, the author of Generation Kill, who unfortunately took his own life last year, but he was a great friend who I met for the first time that summer and wound up being an awesome mentor.
Yeah. And yeah, Evan Wright's work, Generation Kill, is, in my opinion, one of the seminal works about Operation Iraqi Freedom. It is a phenomenal book, and it was born out of a serialization, I believe. But yeah, phenomenal. And first of all, real journalist. You were a real journalist, right? I mean, you were there reporting. Like, don't sell yourself short. But yeah, and you jumped right in 2007. That was huge, a huge time to go to Iraq.
I think that ultimately set up what the model for 2009 and beyond was in Afghanistan, right? Because that was kind of the peak of the surge. It had yielded some results, and we said, well, let's lather, rinse, and repeat in Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And the book, in your book, you talk about how David Petraeus in particular, right, who was kind of the architect of the surge and the whole counterinsurgency template, right, that the U.S. Army started following. He took that model to Afghanistan under President Obama to try and replicate that success. So that's really cool. That's impressive, man, that you were 19 in Iraq during the surge, reporting. That is so incredible to me. And you mentioned that you were the same age as a lot of the soldiers, right?
Yes.
A lot of and of course I think of them as like kids, right? And
right now they seem like kids, but at the time they all seemed like totally full-fledged adults to me.
I do think there's a bit of a very quick coming of age when you're deployed. Like I remember. So I finished up my platoon leader time. I was a junior captain. I was on battalion staff as the S4. And then, I'm working with company XOs. We had done, I don't think we published it in the previous podcast, but I think in our, while we were trying to get it, I think we got edited this one out, but we had these like weird officer mess events. Saw these lieutenants run amok. But
which is what lieutenants do best.
It's what I did. Come on. But the reality is, watching these folks, my first deployment was very kinetic. My second deployment, I didn't have a round shot at me in anger. They certainly did. And watching them, just become men and lead men and, navigate incredibly difficult decisions with extreme levels of ambiguity and 99 times out of 100 making the right call. I was very impressed with the crop of lieutenants that we had during my second deployment, which would have been, 2011,
yeah,
I think.
Sounds about right, yeah.
down in Kandahar. So it's and I think the same thing goes for any 19-year-old out there. I mean, Wesley, when you were out there, they had seen more in a few months in Iraq than most people will in their entire life.
Yeah, people used to say, Iraq ages you in dog years.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So you mentioned that you were still with 132 on its next deployment?
I was.
That your brigade commander that trip was one of the battalion commanders that I embedded with in 2007 in Baghdad. Just another small army connection.
it is. It's such a small world, and talking about the young kids and seeing them grow up. Not to get too philosophical and too maudlin or anything, but it's almost sad, like, yeah, it's impressive how these 19, 20-year-old kids can really pull together and become so mature and do these incredible things and hold these huge, heavy responsibilities. But it's almost heartbreaking that like that has to be the case. You're like, you look at these kids and you're like, man, you should be, out partying and living your life and having a good time and falling in love and getting your heart broken and making bad decisions and, just being a kid. And instead you're here and you're responsible for, 5 to 10 other individuals and making life or death decisions every day. And it's really admirable, but it's also kind of heartbreaking to me at the same time that that's even necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think looking back on it all, some of the people I'm most impressed with when I think back on it are the ones who seemed like the old men in the room, the squad leaders and platoon sergeants who
Yeah.
in reality were in their, mid or maybe late 20s at
Yeah.
most.
25, 26 years old. Yeah.
And who really were sort of when it worked, the professional kind of backbone who like held discipline together, who made young soldiers behave like soldiers, and who did a really great job of it for the most part.
Sure.
In the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
It's a testament, I think, to one, the character of those individuals, and two, the discipline, the system of discipline and maturation, I think, that the Army instills in you. So like we said, you started embedding at 19 years old. You were 22 when you hit Kunar in 2010, which is honestly, so I first got into country at 23.
Yeah,
I think I
about
was
the same
23
age.
in 2009, when I first deployed to RC East to Kunar and Nuristan. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, how do you think that your age at that time affected your embedding with and reporting on the military with these units? Like you said, you were one of the younger guys out there in the game, and when you're talking to, you're doing interviews of everybody, right? From, young soldiers, privates and specialists, all the way up to, battalion, brigade commanders. How do you think your age kind of played into that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not something I really thought about at the time. I think, with guys your own age, maybe there was like an initial like, whoa, you seem pretty young to be out here. And then they're like, well, you're the same age as us. What's the difference? And then, so I feel like with sort of, out with the platoons, age was not a thing that they really noticed at all. It probably would have been more of a thing where like, if I was any older, they would have made fun of me for being old.
Yeah.
With guys like battalion commanders who were, they're like 40, substantially older than me. I think sometimes it was useful to kind of like, this is something that Evan Wright taught me, is it can be useful to play dumb. It can be useful to kind of not be taken seriously initially. And it can be useful, and not that you're doing anything nefarious with that.
Right, you're not being duplicitous or anything.
But if nothing else, people will explain things to you, if as though you don't understand them. Which you need them to do, if as a journalist, you need people to explain the basic things to you so that you can describe them in their words. And that will often, that will reveal things that you might not otherwise get. When I first went to the Pesh in July of 2010, which is, you had just gotten home from your deployment a couple months earlier, I think.
Yeah.
You were probably... No, you were there for 2009, so you'd been back for like 6 months or so.
So I deployed May 09 to May 2010.
Right. And Dave, you were there for the year 2009, basically?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Redeployed in, I think, January of 10.
So, in April of 2010, U.S. forces had come out of the Korengal Valley, which was one of the, these long fought tributary valleys of the Pesh, and that there had been a lot of deliberation for years over, are we going to pull out of this place? If we pull out of this place, is that a win for the Taliban? What's going to happen if we pull out of this place? Is it all a house of cards? And I remember visiting in July 2010, and, the context is, I'm going all around, Sangin, Khost, Zari, all these different places during the Afghan surge. And everywhere I would go, everybody's sort of talking the talk of counterinsurgency, right? I mean, like you said, Dave, it's sort of, they're trying to do what they did in Iraq. Petraeus is the commander again. Everybody's talking this big talk of, especially every battalion commander that I would go and visit on my way out to his platoons would say, look, this is how many outposts we've built. This is how many kilometers of road we've paved. This is how much, how many dollars of CERT money we've spent. And this is how much farther down the road we're going to, we're going to push the ball for the next guy before it's our time, and just, incredible optimism, from every one of these guys, except the battalion commander that I visited in the Pesh, who's a guy named Joe Ryan. Today is a 2-star, I think he's been selected for 3-star. But I remember sitting down with him in his office at Fob Blessing, and him just kind of saying like, hey, the counterinsurgency thing has been going on in this valley longer than it has been going on elsewhere in Afghanistan, and it's not working. And that was, kind of eye-opening for me, and just surprising, right? That a commander would be that frank. And I have no doubt that he was, sort of using me for messaging in some way too. And he's sort of trying to acclimatize his own brigade and division leadership to the idea of, we need to pull out of this place, as he's preparing to make that recommendation up the chain of command, which is what he winds up doing. But that was very surprising to me, just hearing that. I mean, so that was frankly one of the things that I, that made me start the reporting process that led to this book, was just wondering like, oh, what's so different about this place? Like why, and what, or is it different at all? I mean, what's the problem? And that, and then also just, being at these little outposts like Kopp, Michigan at the mouth of the Korengal, which at the time was, the most kinetic, as they would say, or the most frequently attacked, outpost in RC East, since it had sort of started to suck up everything that had been focused on the Korengal until a couple of months earlier. You'd sit there and there's all these, they're under fire, multiple hours a day. And if you ask the company commander there, what's this outpost doing here? Who built it? Why?
Yeah.
Just be like, well, man, it was here when I got here. It was here when the company became under before we got here. Pretty sure it was here when the guy before that got here.
Yep.
Guess it's always been here.
And you mentioned that in the book, and that really struck me because I was deployed to Cop Keating on and off when I first got into country, and there was a BBC, I want to say, crew that came and embedded with my troop at Cop Keating. And they asked the troop commander at the time, they were like, well, what is your purpose for being here? And his response was essentially like, I'm here because this is where they told me to go.
Right.
Like that's, and they asked a platoon leader and one of his senior scouts, I think, and it was, I think it was like during a tick, like they had been taking some fire on the Cop, and they're like hunkered down by, and take it with a grain of salt because I haven't seen the clip in a while. I meant to look it up in prep for the episode, but I got overcome by events. But they're like, hey, what is your purpose here? And the platoon leader was basically like, we don't ask those types of questions,
Right.
like
Yeah.
we're here because they told us to be here. And it really struck me because,
Which is the right answer, but
right. I mean, it is, but also, you would hope that like the people who are in charge of these places, and I don't say this to fault, the commanders and the lieutenants and everything. It's not on them, right? But you would hope that there would be some sort of higher level guidance of like, this is your mission. This is what you are doing here. This is your task and purpose for being here, rather than like, you're here for the next year and good luck. And that was something that I did jot down that I wanted to touch on, right? Was,
yeah. I mean, this is a thing that could be pretty awkward for commanders who this stage in the war, I mean, to you guys, a battalion commander was kind of like the old man who probably it seemed like either he knew everything that was going on, or at least he thought he knew everything that was going on. But often these battalion commanders had pretty severe doubts about what was going on, and they were in a position of kind of having to explain to the soldiers what the mission was that they're doing there, when they themselves are trying to explain to their brigade commander, "Hey, time's up. This thing is not working. We could accomplish everything we're doing here with some drone strikes and some artillery, and not risk anybody's lives."
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Dave, but I think it speaks to something that I jotted down, which was that there seemed to be a disconnect between like strategic and operational level objectives and what they were expecting tactical units to do. And that manifested in a lot of different ways, right? And Dave and I kind of talked about this a couple of days ago before, as we were prepping for the episode and talking about what we'd read, the differences in mission between like SOF and conventional forces, and how those would bump up against each other a lot of times, because the conventional guys are out there trying to do counterinsurgency and trying to win the trust of these local elders and all this kind of stuff in these local villages. And then the SOF guys will come in doing their counterterrorism thing, which is a separate mission. And they come in and they're kicking down doors in the middle of the night and dragging people out, and, or dropping bombs or, drone strikes or whatever. And that creates a tension between those two missions. And then the whole counterinsurgency theories of, the ink blots and the ink lines, the oil blots and all that. And, you mentioned the self-licking ice cream cone. It becomes a sort of like self-reinforcing thing of, we're here and it's antagonizing them, so they shoot at us, which antagonizes us to bring more people in, which antagonizes them further. And I know that there were competing theories on that, as far as like, hey, if we fight them in Nuristan and Kunar, that frees up, Kabul, it frees up Kandahar to focus on not the fight, but the development. But then there was also the competing theory of like, well, if we had those resources that we're dedicating to, Kunar, Nuristan, RC East, all these outlying kind of hinterland places, if we took those resources and put them back towards Kabul and Kandahar and the population centers, we'd be much more effective at doing counterinsurgency there. So I know there were like some competing theories there. And again, sorry, Dave, I didn't mean to step on you. So please, by all means.
Yeah, I was just, we were, having a conversation about what story we were telling our soldiers, what story we were telling ourselves, frankly, because I think I know what I was briefed. I know what our mission was in terms of what it was on the PowerPoint slide before we actually deployed and got into country. I was positioned at Cop Monte. I think there was a Stars and Stripes article at some point that said, "Welcome to Cop Monte. Here's your Purple Heart." It was a fairly kinetic environment. I think the hinterlands is a good way of describing that. But I remember, so at some point during the deployment, I had a reporter and his team from Al Jazeera English come in and just in bed. And there's a clip out there on YouTube. But he basically asks me, hey, the enemy's out in the mountains, you're here in the village, like, what's up with that? And I remember towing kind of the quote unquote company line of the people are the decisive terrain in a counterinsurgency fight. Like it's not about like if I'm in the mountains, it's just to keep them away from the people. If they're staying away from the people, then problem solved. But I think the reality is, and Wesley, when I was reading, even just the opening couple of chapters of your book, there was a disconnect. I think at different levels, but there was a complete disconnect in the amount of intelligence and what as a Asmar district in Kunar province. That was my AO. At the time, Lieutenant Poe was responsible for security and counterinsurgency operations in Asmar. I didn't know, I thought I did. Very naive. I thought I knew the game I was playing. And I think before we started recording, I made the comment, I wasn't even playing the same sport. And I think some of the reporting that you did and some of what you put in your book, if that was known at the time, it didn't really trickle down to conventional forces. The special operations community and what they knew about the kind of the relationships between different warlords, different tribes, different elders. Like for the layman who might be watching this or listening to this, Afghanistan, especially at the time, wasn't a country like we think of the United States, right? Where, there's an American flag out on every other house, and especially at this time. people identified more with tribal affiliations before they identified as, Afghani sometimes. And the Pesh, the Kunar River Valley, Nuristan, very very heavily Pashto influenced, large concentrations there, and they spread across internationally recognized borders, right, between Pakistan's northwest tribal areas and kind of those eastern provinces in Afghanistan. But a lot of those folks, I mean, their daily commute was through those international borders. It's not like there's, customs sitting there at the border checking them in back and forth. So it was we were playing a different game. I would like to say that we had a positive impact during the stay there, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it was keep them occupied, so that the decisive effort in other parts of the country could take place.
Yeah, I mean, Dan Kearney, one of the company commanders in the book, today a colonel, who he's in the documentary Restrepo, kind of comes across as like this big meathead, knocking things down in the Korengal. And one of the things that he told me, and he was pretty reflective for the book, was he was like, "Yeah, man, I was drinking my own Kool-Aid. I was pouring this stuff into my guys' mouths to keep their morale up, and I was drinking it too because I needed to.
You kind of have to, yeah."
And he was telling that with kind of the benefit of subsequently having done a bunch of deployments with the Ranger Regiment doing that night raid mission, which I think in a lot of ways could seem like the simpler, clearer cut, more satisfying mission where you can kind of quantify results. But that's not necessarily making any more progress than the counterinsurgency mission is doing. And often, as you kind of nodded to, these two missions could really be at cross purposes with each other. They could be mutually supporting, and at times they were, but very often they were not. I mean, there's an episode that I recount in the book, and this is actually I'm doing another book now that's basically just about this. It's about the role of JSOC and its British and Australian peer units during the Iraq and Afghanistan surges, and kind of what organizational culture in these units, what led some units to go off the rails, like the Australian SAS, and other units to kind of stay more on the straight and narrow. But there was a raid outside Cop, Michigan in 2009, at a time when the JSOC task force went by the code name Task Force 373. And this raid, they hit a house, they killed an old man in the house who it turned out was the cook for the A&A on the outpost. And, obviously this is the kind of thing that creates a problem. And so for the platoon that lived at Cop, Michigan, they joked that they discovered that night what 373 stood for, which was the 3 minutes it took the operators to kill everyone in the house, the 7 months of hard counterinsurgency work that it undid, and the 3 years generously that it was going to take to put things back together. And so I think, by 2010, when I visited the Pesh, you were seeing the cumulative effects of all this violence, whether it's the night raids, whether it's, just rounds falling short, whether it's, somebody shooting somebody that they shouldn't have, a touchy trigger finger during an escalation of force, checkpoint at the beginning of a deployment when you don't know that there's not suicide bombers in this place. And it's just so, the theory of counterinsurgency was, okay, we build these outposts by the villages and we'll create kind of a security bubble that will keep the Taliban away, keep the Taliban up in the hills. But over time, as the U.S. military took casualties and became increasingly risk averse and increasingly unwilling to do those kind of like long, aggressive foot patrols up into the mountains, became increasingly road bound to the point where that security bubble collapsed and there was no security bubble. There really just was. These outposts were under attack. American troops were defending the outposts. They'd been built up into these little concrete fortresses. And then what surrounded the outposts was essentially a bubble of danger, not a bubble of security. And so you could see how by that point, a lot of Afghans who early on had been, often very excited about the U.S. military presence and willing to stick their necks out, willing to provide intelligence, no longer were, because it just felt like it wasn't worth it. There was just this accumulating toll of civilian casualties, either directly caused by the U.S. or indirectly caused by the U.S., in that the U.S. was causing by being there, was bringing in the fighting that was causing a Taliban rocket to land short, or the Taliban to drag somebody out of the village and execute them for being a spy, whatever. It all contributed to there being kind of a half-life to counterinsurgency that by 2010 it had expired in the Pesh. And you could see this. Intuitive sense of it was, okay, you'd see these long firefights and you'd see, okay, actually very few people are getting hurt on the American outpost because it's been built up into this little concrete fortress. And then you'd hear, okay, the JDAM drops up on the mountain, and ends the firefight. But then the same machine gun starts shooting a few minutes later, and it's like, well, okay, the enemy also knows exactly how long it's going to take for the first mortar round to start falling versus how long before a Kiowa shows up versus how long before an F-16 shows up. And so it kind of there was this tremendous amount of firepower being expended. I'd never seen anything like it elsewhere in Iraq or Afghanistan, but not too many people on either side really getting hurt. But then the civilians live there. They're in the middle, and they are
catching the brunt. Yeah.
And that works to the Taliban's advantage and to the U.S. and the U.S.-backed government's disadvantage.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think to expand on that, the counterinsurgency versus counterterrorism mission that soft versus conventional forces had. When I first got into country, so part of the surge, right? So Cop Monte was manned by a platoon plus, but a platoon. We rolled in with a company, so we expanded the combat power by 3. I remember the platoon leader that we were leaving. He pointed out this valley about, I don't remember, 4 or 5 clicks north of Cop Monte. It was the Dob Valley, kind of a dry riverbed that rolled through it. It wasn't even villages. It's just a couple of buildings, clusters of buildings as you go through. Said, hey, but the mountainside was so steep that if the enemy was on top of the mountain, they could point a weapon straight down, and we couldn't depress our 50 cals or 249s or 240s, whatever, far enough to shoot back. So they just didn't go that way without air support. He goes, we don't go north of Dob without air support. So of course, my company commander, first mission out the gate, we're going to Dob. That was our first company operation. Fortunately, I think just maybe the influx of the amount of combat power we brought, we didn't have as much of an issue. I mean, we got in contact plenty of times at Dob, but I spent a lot of time north of that area. Fast forward 8-9 months into the deployment, we're now starting to spend CERT funds, and there's a village kind of just around the corner. I think we built a well there, little mini hydropower plants right along some of these wadis and streams. The elders from Dob went to the local sub-governor in Asmar and said, well, why aren't we getting any of this? So we sat down. This was now month 10, we're almost done. We sat down and we said, hey, listen, we don't go into your valley because every time we go up there, we get shot at. Yeah. So we're not going to send contractors in there and risk their lives. So we came up with an agreement. I mean, it seems naive at the time, but it's like, hey, listen, show me that they said, well, we can control that. And we said, okay, show us that you can. I'm for the next 30 days, Afghan National Police, Afghan National Army, U.S. coalition forces, whatever the case may be, no contact. Show us that you can kind of control security in your village. And they did. And so we brought them back in. We started having conversations about where we were going to place wells. This was kind of that good faith effort to try to, we're not the bad guys. We're here to help. The Kool-Aid, so to speak, that we were feeding ourselves. Now I'm on the other end of the deployment. The company that's relieving us is there. I'm partnering with the platoon leader. We're doing left seat, right seat rides. Half my platoon is already redeployed home, but I'm going out on patrol with his platoon. Somebody comes knocking at our door late at night. I don't remember Rangers, SF. I don't remember who they were. A couple of really high speed came in, briefed us on a mission they had just done in Dob. Unfortunately, there were a lot of civilian casualties in that mission. I looked at that platoon leader and I said, good luck, man. We spent a year trying to get them to the table, and we just did. And we reset this, to your point, years.
Yeah. And it's funny, you're talking about, hey, show us you can control this security. And, Wesley, you talk a lot about this in the book. There were certainly, undoubtedly, foreign fighters in the region, right? There were definitely Al-Qaeda guys. There were definitely foreign fighters. And that's a lot of what SOF and the intelligence community were going after. But there was a lot of blame shifted to those foreign fighters, to those Al-Qaeda operatives, by village elders who were saying oh, no. When you get shot at, it's not by Korangalis. It's not by, Kunaris. It's not by our people. It's by them. which of course was not the case, right? And you mentioned like, oh, the idea is to separate the enemy from the population, but you can't in this region because they're one and the same. And to Dave's point, when you are getting shot at in this valley every time you go, and then the elders are coming to you going, well, why aren't we getting these hydroelectric dams and these wells and all these things? And you go, well, can you make them stop shooting at us? And they go, yeah, we can do that. And then they go and they make them stop shooting at you. And you go, well, where has this been? Like, why didn't you do this before? You know, like this seems kind of self-evident. And it's like, if, you know, oh, okay, you do have control over these guys. So we've been getting shot at this whole time just on your whim. And, you know, there's a lot of that in the book as far as like, you know, who are we actually fighting? Are we going after these foreign fighters? Are we going after, you know, for the counterinsurgency? Are we separating the population from the enemy because they're the same people?
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that illustrates is, you know, it's very easy to kind of, you know, to strip Afghans of their agency and to sort of think, oh, well, we're the actor here, and maybe the Taliban is the other actor, but forget about, you know, both we and in many cases the Taliban are outside visitors in, you know, in this area. You know, many of the fighters are locals, but there also are many out of area fighters who are coming in, whether foreign or just Taliban fighters from elsewhere in Afghanistan. And the people who really know what's going on in the place are Afghan government officials and sort of the local power brokers, the elders of the village, the businessmen who have their fingers in the timber
barons, yeah,
whatever it is. And you know, anybody who is an outsider and who is there for kind of there's a time clock on how long they're going to be there is instrumentalized, right? Like people are trying to get what they can out of this latest batch of foreigners before they go home. And they know everything that's happened in this village. They know everything that you'll never know. They know all of that. And you know, you see this. The Korengal is a great example of it. I mean, there are versions of this that play out in every single area of operations in Afghanistan. But the Korengal is a great example of a place where essentially the U.S. and the Taliban wound up fighting each other in this valley, in large part because the U.S. had sort of unwittingly allied itself with one side of a commercial timber dispute. Back in the dawn of the war, and had kind of interfered in the Korengali timber trade on behalf of other people, you know, the next party out, who were the Korengali's business partner for getting the timber to Pakistan. Because in the sort of the simplistic U.S. view, it's, well, Haji Jandad is the government, so we're working on behalf of the government. But Haji Jandad is not only the government. Haji Jandad is also the timber baron who buys timber from the Korengalis to get it across the border, and who used the fact that he had the U.S. military on his side and a commercial timber ban on his side to change the terms of his business agreement in a way that the Korengalis thought was deeply unfair, and they brought in the Taliban as their muscle because Haji Jandad brought in the U.S. as his muscle. And that's something that every U.S. company in the Korengal kind of had to relearn to a certain degree every single time, because, you know, that's sort of a layer deeper than what you're going to get during the Riptoa of, like, these are the tactics of how you stay alive on patrol.
Yeah. And, you know, you just mentioned, like, you're on a timeline, right? Every unit that was there for somewhere between 9 to 16 months, right? I think 16 was the longest anybody spent in the area. But, you know, and that's, it goes back to Vietnam, right? And that saying, like, you know, you've got the watches, but we got the time. And those people live there. They've lived there for, you know, hundreds of generations, and they're going to be there long after you're gone. You are a visitor there. And in a lot of ways, the Taliban's a visitor there, right? The region that we're talking about, in my mind, is almost like a microcosm of Afghanistan itself within Afghanistan, right? You know, you talk about Afghanistan.
Yeah. In some ways, it's almost like Afghanistan on steroids. A lot of the challenges of other parts of Afghanistan are magnified there, whether it's the tactical and terrain challenges, or whether it's kind of the human intelligence understanding challenges, because instead of 2 languages, you're dealing with 9 languages.
Yeah, 16 languages. Yeah, between 16 valleys, they've all got their own language. And there's a lot of this that I think echoes America's experience in Vietnam, right? And I don't think it's hyperbole to characterize Afghanistan, especially this region of Afghanistan, as our generation's Vietnam. Like you said, the nature of the fight, especially in this region, was way different. It was way more of a slugfest than you saw anywhere else in Afghanistan or Iraq, right? You mentioned in the book, it's not a matter of, IEDs. There were definitely IEDs in the area, but it's, you're talking about young riflemen, and machine gunners using their personal weapons over long distances. You're not kicking indoors and doing this house to house fighting. Um, you know,
Yeah,
there,
no, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned a phrase I use at the beginning and the end of the book is Kunar syndrome,
yeah,
which describes kind of, there are this war affected many Americans' lives in many different ways. Some guys, it's just was horrible and it ruined their lives and it's something they never want to think about again. But there are other guys who got totally hooked on it and who kept trying to pull the strings to go back to Kunar over and over again because it was such a different and more exciting kind of war with all this artillery, all the airstrikes, all the gunfights. Um, Dave, you were in 132. I mean, 132 wound up having a subsequent deployment. After two Kunar deployments, right, you get an Arghandab Valley deployment where it's just going out the gate, waiting for somebody to step on a bomb, like for 12 months. But yeah, I mean, there's a guy who I talk about a couple times in the book, a guy named Steve, who was a 132 private in the Korengal, and actually gets one of his nuts shot off in the Korengal. And I end the book with, he wound up staying in the army for a long time. He went back. He was on your deployment in Kunar with 132. He was on the Kandahar deployment in Kunar with 132. And he wound up he was back in 2019 or so, as I was kind of winding down this book project and the war was winding down. He was an E7 with one of the SFABs, doing the advisor thing back in RC East again. He signed up for the SFAB basically because he had been very bored in the regular units that he'd been in for the past few years. They weren't doing anything exciting anymore. And he was told, the SFAB is the way back into combat. That turned out not really to be the case. He winds up doing kind of inside the wire advisor duty at this big base. And while he's doing that, one of the ways that he entertains himself is he goes and looks at like Blue Eye or whatever it's called, the kind of where you could log in and look at ISR feed. Yeah. And he looks at task force feeds that are looking at the Korengal, his old stomping grounds, and he can see that the Taliban and ISIS are fighting each other in the Korengal, in the same place that the Taliban and his old and his company used to fight each other. And he can't like take a screenshot of it or anything, but so he goes and finds the corresponding ISIS and Taliban propaganda clips that they've released through their media outlets about them fighting each other in the Korengal, and he posts this on Facebook to like an attack company Korengal veterans group, and just showing that these two guys are there. And he writes, I'd give my left nut, basically implying like he wants to go back. He has this nostalgia for this place. I mean, I talked to him about it, and yeah, I mean, he was like, yeah, nothing I ever saw anywhere else in the army compared to the camaraderie, the intensity that I had in the Korengal as a young soldier. And there is, and when you see the responses in the comment section on this Facebook group, it's everybody's chiming in. They're like, oh hell yeah, troops in the open, oh I'll go get the pig, and it's just there often was a kind of nostalgia for this deeply unproductive segment of the war.
yeah.
That you wouldn't see for a place like Sangin or Arghandab, where there was no excitement, there was just anxiety.
The dirty secret, I think, is, and it's kind of an open secret, but the dirty little secret is that the times that you almost die are the times that you feel most alive, right? And so, when you are in the mud, getting shot at with your buddies and, you're doing everything you can to survive, like, you're never going to feel more alive than that moment. And I think that there are so many parallels, to Vietnam, right? Trying to separate the population from the fighters, the continuity of units, which, you touch on again and again and again in the book. And one huge example of that is the distinction between the Special Forces A teams, right? Team 936 and Team 361, and how they handled things completely differently, even though Team 361 came in and relieved Team 936 and had a completely different outlook on how to operate in the area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was kind of a glimpse of things to come in the Pesh when that happened in 2004. Is you've got two A teams that on paper they look the same. Everybody's been to the same schools at Fort Bragg. It's organized the same way. But one is a Utah National Guard team of like old guys who did not have anything to prove. And then the other was, a team of young third group guys, active duty guys who are on like their third rotation already in 2004, think they know everything, don't really want to hear anything the National Guard guys have to say, and just have, diametrically different approaches. And the third group guys help ignite the flame that is the Korengal, with their unnecessarily heavy-handed tactics.
Yeah, and it just kind of makes me wonder, if, because it really seems like we didn't learn any lessons from Vietnam, right? We threw so many resources and so many people into Vietnam, and it seems like we didn't learn anything from it. And it makes me wonder, like, what we've learned from Afghanistan. Are we, is the next time we do counterinsurgency, are we going to be making these same exact mistakes? And, my hope is that the answer is no, but
I mean, one would hope we don't have
tells me
counterinsurgency again, but it's not a choice that the military gets to make.
exactly.
And that's the unfortunate thing. And I think that we are, unfortunately, after Vietnam, the Army deliberately threw away a lot of the lessons of counterinsurgency. It deliberately jettisoned a lot of knowledge, because it was like, well, fuck that. That was horrible. And now we're going to prepare for an actual consequential war that we might win. And I think there's a big parallel to that today in the Army of
100%.
Someone, Andrew Exum, former Army Ranger, later Pentagon official, said early on in Ukraine, Ukraine is the best excuse the Army has ever had to just forget about Afghanistan and pretend it didn't happen.
100%. And even while I was still in, I mean, almost even before we pulled out of Afghanistan completely in 2021, there was already a shift underway in focus, right, from counterinsurgency to what's called LISCO, large-scale combat operations. And you saw the same thing after Vietnam, right, where it was no longer about fighting, groups of insurgents in the jungle, small groups and trying to win over the population. It was, how are we going to destroy this column of enemy tanks, right? It's going to be this large-scale, huge force-on-force, near-peer fight, and that's what we're prepping for. And then, of course, we ended up in, Desert Storm, and it was like, hey, that's, great. Great proof of concept for the way that our military is set up. And then a decade later, and it's, hey, guess what? We're in Afghanistan doing counterinsurgency again. And so, yeah.
I mean, I think another big parallel with Vietnam that we're seeing now, is, as people process what happened, process how did defeat happen? How did failure happen? After Vietnam, there was kind of a stabbed in the back narrative that emerged within the Army of, well, we won all these tactical victories. If only we hadn't had our hands tied in various ways by the politicians, by the media, by popular support, by the law of armed conflict, by rules of engagement. If we'd been able to go ham, then we could have won. And in my sort of current work that I'm doing, interviewing a ton of former JSOC guys, about their war. And I think especially in the aftermath of 2021 and in the climate that we have with Secretary Hegseth, I think there is definitely an emerging stabbed in the back narrative that's gaining steam and popularity and kind of, becoming an alternate history of, well, the problem with Afghanistan wasn't, an inherent structural problem of Pakistan being there.
We just didn't bomb them enough.
An inherent structural problem of like the government being corrupt that we were trying to pop up. It's, well, we fought like a wimpy war. We fought like a wimpy woke coin war. And if only we had the handcuffs taken off and had been able to just do a lot of killing, that, what that ignores is it's really not like we didn't do a lot of killing.
We did so much,
but I think that's a narrative that really is gaining steam, and I think is going to, just like after Vietnam, be a very powerful narrative for a lot of people. And you can see it emerging just from, if you look at, sort of the industry of, former soft guy podcasts that has an incredibly, he's a big popular audience among, young American men, including the young men who are the next generation of soldiers. Mm-hmm. This is sort of the version of the war that they're getting. And it's a version of the war that often kind of erases the experience, not only of Afghans, but also the experience of the conventional troops who really bore the burden of much of the wars during their first, 10 to 12 years.
Yeah. And you already see that in action. They're already doing things like disbanding organizations that keep track of civilian casualties and coming up with ways to minimize civilian casualties, because the prevailing idea in a lot of corners is, we just didn't kill enough. And the idea is that you could kill your way out of Afghanistan, which is clearly not the case, because like you said, and like you point out in your book, like organizations like JSOC, and the CIA. They did a lot of killing in Afghanistan. A lot of times, people that they
And it
should
was,
have
you know, at
killed.
the time, it was pretty common wisdom. It was sort of just conventional wisdom, this aphorism of you can't kill your way out of an insurgency. Now, I think, you know, kind of with the benefit of, you know, some time and some distance, and people are sort of forgetting some of the realities of what it was like, people are going, oh, maybe we could have killed our way out of that insurgency.
The anecdote you talk about in the book with the AC-130 strike, and I can't remember exactly what unit it was. I know it was a Marine platoon.
Yeah, this was a platoon from 1-3 Marines in
Yeah.
Landigal in the Korengal.
And you know, the AC-130 got called in and given permission to fire without really consulting the Marines that were on the ground. It was called in, and oh, hey, we see, you know, these figures darting in and out of a cave, and so they opened fire without any sort of consultation with the Marines that were on the ground there, already conducting BDA on a bomb strike that had failed. And they ended up killing, you know, like a dozen kids with this AC-130 strike. And then we have this you know, shocked face of like, why do these people hate us? You know, why are they fighting us?
I mean, it's one of these instances that plays out over and over again, where something that looked, you know, under a time crunch and through, you know, green and black night vision footage from a gunship, and with confirmation bias, thinking that you've got an enemy leader in the town, you know, what actually was a group of small children with an old man who had been sent out of the town, you know, for safety into the woods, you know, and they're kind of by a boulder, by a stream. That gets interpreted as, well, that's a bunch of men who have gone out of the town and are you know, trying to find their weapons or something under this boulder, and they just get obliterated. And then, you know, I mean, the effects of that are, I mean, the idea that village of Landigal was ever going to have anything but hatred for the United States after that is ludicrous.
Fantasy.
And you can understand how subsequent units can think they're coming in, well, we didn't do that. We had nothing to do with this. I mean, come on, give us the benefit of the doubt. But they're not going to, not any more than you would in a similar situation. And similarly, I mean, there was tremendous moral injury for that platoon, even though they weren't the ones who did it. You know, the platoon leader actually of that Marine platoon, he wound up spending much of his career dedicating his career to civilian harm mitigation. And he was in this. I mean, I don't know what's happened to him, but he has been working in that the organization that now is being, you know, gutted by you know, the civilian harm mitigation enterprise that's being disbanded.
Yeah, and
I do think there's I think one of the major differences between Iraq and Afghanistan is I think we had clear objectives, right or wrong, as a nation. I think we had clear objectives of what we wanted to do in Iraq. I think Afghanistan didn't get a lot of attention for most of that war. It was really only towards the end that it got the attention from, you know, national level leadership and senior military commanders that got the right resources, or at least more resources to conduct its mission. For the audience, again, who may be listening, we've used the term counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. They have two very different mission sets, right? So when you think counterinsurgency, that's winning over the population. That's an attempt to, we've used the term separate the insurgents who theoretically are coming in, right, and embedding themselves amongst the population and displacing them from that population so that you could eventually win them over to your side of that argument. Counterterrorism's very kinetic. We're going after bad guys, usually in very, very lethal ways. It could be boots on the ground with conventional or special forces. It could be drones. It could be, you know, bomb strikes. You know, the mission that got Osama bin Laden, that's a classic example of a counterterrorism mission. But with this notion that you can kill your way out of a coin or counterinsurgency, I mean, this movie came out about the time I think I was born, but Red Dawn, right? This idea of a Soviet invasion of
America,
of the United States.
The best scene in that movie, and this may be what you're getting at, is there's a scene where there's a Cuban guy embedded with the Soviet company, and he's trying to explain to them, like, this is not how this works. You have to be nicer to these people if you want them to cooperate. You know?
Yeah, it's this. You unless you're willing to kill everyone, which of course you're not. You cannot kill your way out of a counterinsurgency. It's interesting because I think we would look at it in a very different lens if it was our country. You know, we boast about the per capita rate of how many weapons we own per American and how difficult it would be for an occupying army to, like, we would, even if our military was defeated, which is unlikely, even if it was defeated, like the insurgency that would erupt is a very well armed, very frankly well trained in population. Again, that's what Afghanistan was, and I think a lot of this does fall back to a clear mission on what we were trying to accomplish there. Because if it was preventing the Taliban, stabilizing an Afghani government and preventing the Taliban from, reclaiming control, or another organization that has animosity with the United States, like, newsflash, we failed in that one pretty spectacularly.
I think another big difference between Iraq and Afghanistan is basically where the U.S. and the government that was hosting it overlapped versus didn't overlap in how they conceived of the war and who the enemy was. In Iraq, where the U.S. never made any traction really was in combating the Shia militias, because a series of prime ministers, that's those same Shia political parties are a big part of their coalition and their constituency. Where we did make progress was in fighting, the Al Qaeda-led AQI and then ISIS insurgency. I mean, that's what JSOC, went to work on, gobbling up from the bottom up with its raids. And Prime Minister Maliki, during the surge, he was willing to really go to bat for the United States when we made mistakes or killed the wrong people in the course of going after AQI, because to him, the AQI was an existential threat to his government. I mean, he saw it in a little bit of a different way. He saw them as he really saw Sunnis as an existential threat to his government more generally. But so he was very much on board, hook, line, and sinker with the project the United States was undertaking in fighting the Sunni insurgency. If you look over at Afghanistan, I think that's really just not the case. I mean, for President Karzai, every low-level Taliban fighter killed was a problem. He did not really see ever the Taliban as the enemy in the same way that the United States saw the Taliban as the enemy. I mean, he saw the Taliban as a problem for sure, but he and it were competing for the same rural Pashtun political base. So he was never on board in the same way. And the idea that you could I think that was a pretty structural deficiency in the conflict, and one that more killing wasn't an option there. I mean, because he would have just kicked us out.
Yeah, and I think that in some ways we tried, and we already talked about the surge, right? Which not necessarily a good example of what I'm saying here, but I think in a lot of ways we tried to apply the same lessons from Iraq to Afghanistan once Afghanistan did start receiving that attention, with no concept that they are two entirely different, very different countries.
It's in a very cookie cutter way.
Yeah, and Iraq, and this is not to say that Iraq was not or is not fractured socially and politically, but it couldn't hold a candle to the ways that Afghanistan is not homogenous, right? As we kind of mentioned, like every valley has its own language in Kunar and Nuristan province, right? They have their own cultures. You talk in the book, and this is something that I was briefed before we went to Nuristan. Nuristan has a very deep history of rebellion, of not assimilating to wider Afghan culture, which wider Afghan culture itself is not homogenous at all. But these places, these people in these outlying places are really very unique. Had not been converted to Islam until incredibly recently, right? I mean, they were animists up until very recently. And they have
the Taliban today is facing some of these same governance challenges.
Right. Yeah.
In Kunar and Nuristan. I mean, it's dealing with, it wants to monetize the timber, and it's being advised by its own former Nuristani Taliban commanders, don't do that.
Yeah. Do not. Yeah. It's a death trap.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you touched on this a little bit. And of course, Dave and I think, could probably talk on this a good bit as well. But you've interviewed a lot of soldiers, a lot of service members after their deployments to the region and in other locations, obviously. How would you kind of characterize the personal toll that these types of combat deployments, especially the ones to Kunar, Nuristan provinces, what kind of toll those can take on people? You mentioned, Kunar syndrome. what kind of toll does that take on these young men and women, and on the journalists that embed with them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge range of ways that it can manifest itself. I mean, what does a year in Kunar and Urstan do to somebody? I know people for whom it was a kind of a searing event, but really like a fulfilling one, an exciting one, and one that helped drive them on to kind of bigger and better things. Whether it's winding up in Delta Force, or whether it's going and getting a PhD, or being really successful in business or something like that. But there are also people that it absolutely ruined. I mean, there was one kid that I talk about in the book, not a kid anymore, but he was a kid when he first went to the Korengal, did a year in the Korengal with 10th Mountain, horrible experience. Essentially re-enlisted. He still had a bunch of time on his enlistment, and the Army at the time in 2007 was saying, well, look, if you re-enlist, you can choose your duty station. So he did that and chose Fort Hood because he would prefer anything but go back to the Korengal, right? So he's going to go to the land of tanks and Bradleys, hopefully wind up back in Iraq or something. But they stand up a light infantry brigade at Fort Hood, and he winds up in the one company in the Army that's headed back to the Korengal. Does a second year in the Korengal, and halfway through that year, basically doesn't come home from leave. Really serious mental health and drug problems, and the whole rest of his life, he was on a helicopter that was shot down on his way to leave. I mean, the whole rest of his life has been a horrible struggle. And I mean, that's sort of the other version of the spectrum. There's very often I talk to guys who, former commanders, former platoon sergeants, whatever, who will tell me, I've lost more guys from my platoon, my company, my battalion to suicide since the war than I lost in the war. And that's, it's kind of a shockingly common thing to hear. So yeah, I mean, it's a range of things. And how you can't always pin it to the war exactly, because all kinds of things happen in people's lives, and you don't really know what the war, what it would have been like without the war. But it certainly is an event that that touches everybody that lives through it.
Yeah, definitely. Dave, what are your thoughts on that?
There are some folks that have, even the folks who've been very successful in their lives, professionally, personally, whatever the case may be. It's not like they're not carrying a massive amount of baggage with them. They may have better support structures. I mentioned, we kicked this episode off with, Steve's been Steve and his wife have been a huge level of support for me. Not everybody has that, right? I think a lot of times when folks make that, kind of that final decision, they're in, and a lot of times they're in an extreme sense of loneliness, even if they're surrounded by people who love them. If you can't relate, if you can't talk to people, if you can't bear those burdens and have, or shed those burdens and have somebody help you with that, I think you can feel very isolated and very alone and kind of in with your own thoughts. And so I don't think there's I'm not a therapist, but I don't think that there's a cookie cutter. If you have these things, you are more likely to. But I don't know anybody who went to Kunar or Nurstan for that matter and wasn't impacted fundamentally in some way.
No, I remember one guy telling me, and I think he's still in the Army, but he had been a platoon leader in 1 through 2 on the previous deployment, the one before you were there. And he said that for years he would dream about the Korengal every night, except for while he was deployed with Ranger Battalion. So that was the relief.
Yeah, and it's it's a very strange thing, because even among service members, right? It's a minority of service members who actually see combat, and it's a minority of even those who see the levels of conflict and combat that you see in these deployments to Kunar and Nurstan.
Multiple times.
Yeah.
Like these folks who went to Kunar kept going back multiple times.
And we've already talked about how it was such a different fight than anywhere else, and you end up with folks who have been through things that it's hard for other people to relate to, or we think it is, right? As the people who have been through it ourselves, we think it's hard to relate to. And, we mentioned things like moral injury. We mentioned things like isolation. I'll say for my part, I do a terrible, terrible job of keeping up with anybody from that unit that I deployed with. And it was one of those things where when I first got back, right, we were so bonded through our trauma that it, like, those people were my life, right? And as I moved forward, I realized that the level of attachment that I had to these people, it centered my entire life around like the worst day of my life, right? The worst experiences of my life. And, you know, a lot of these people, they're phenomenal people. They're great human beings. They're wonderful Americans. And, you know, I love them and God bless them. But it was one of those things where it was unhealthy for me to maintain such tight connections because it really centered my life around this terrible event. And then what ended up happening is I ended up swinging too far the other way, where I kind of just gradually, slowly, quietly, not even, I don't even want to say deliberately, but just kind of started drifting away from everybody that I was in that unit with. But then what that did is that it kind of severed my connection to a lot of the people who would understand the most of what I had been through, what I was going through, or so I thought. And of course my wife is phenomenal, and she's, you know, she worked at the VA with Vietnam veterans, early on in her career. So she understands a lot about this. She's the one who got me into therapy, got me into, you know, behavioral health, treatment. You know, really knew which buttons to push to kind of convince me to go. But I did go through some really intense group therapy sessions where I had this concept of like the things that I've been through and the things that I feel moral injury for, like no one's going to understand, you know, like this was terrible and I feel so awful about the things that happened. And, you know, I blame myself for a lot of it. And I went and I was so hesitant, so reticent to share these things, even with people that I was in this combat PTSD support group with. And when I finally was able to share my experiences and some of the worst things that I had been through, and I was like, I blame myself for these things, right? And literally everyone in the room was like, no, like, why would you blame yourself? Like, that's clearly beyond your control. That's clearly, you know, and it was just such a huge relief to unburden myself of that. I think one of the things that we kind of take for granted is that, or we assume is that no one's going to understand, no one's going to be able to listen and to, you know, lean on. And I think that isolation ends up causing a lot of the issues where we see people unfortunately take their own lives. You know, people, I had a good friend of mine that I served with. He's currently a first sergeant. He may have just stepped out of the role, but he's a first sergeant, in the Army. And one of his really good friends that he was serving alongside with as a fellow first sergeant did end up attempting and completing suicide, essentially right in front of him. You know, and I was talking with this guy, and, you know, he was like, I just don't understand, you know, it seems like it's such a terrible thing to do, and to, you know, to leave your family, leave your, you know, your spouse and your kids and your friends. And I told him, I said, what you have to understand, man, is that when someone gets in that hole like that, they don't feel like that's the case. They don't feel like they are leaving these people behind and that they are creating this burden for them. They feel like the burden, and they feel like they are unburdening their family members by taking this action. They feel like they are making the world a better place by leaving it. But a lot of that stems from that isolation, and it stems from that feeling that no one's going to understand what you have to say, or what you have to share, or what you've experienced, or what's going on inside. And so, you know, I got on the TikTok machine, which I'm very new to, and I'm doing a really horrible job at it. But I got on our podcast TikTok a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, hey, look, everyone understands that there's a veteran suicide epidemic, right? Everyone understands that, you know, everyone knows 22 a day, right? That's something everybody can quote. What are we doing about it, right? Like, raising awareness we're past that. We've raised awareness. Like, what are we doing about it? And I think at the end of the day, the most important, like, groundwork thing that we can do is be there for each other. Let each other know that, you know, I'm here for you. You can open up to me. I'm not going to judge you, right? Which isn't always an easy thing, but because it's a very vulnerable thing, even from the people that you're sharing with, right? If you come to me with these things, like that creates a vulnerability for both of us. But I think it's a really important, hugely important thing to do is to be there for each other, and to open that aperture of like, it's not the trauma Olympics. We don't have to measure sizes here, and measure experiences, like the things that I've been through and the things that you've been through. One of the things that really hit me hard one time is I was chatting with another officer that I was serving with, and we were both intel at the time, and he was a former infantry guy, Ranger Tab. He'd been through combat and all that kind of stuff. And, he was saying like, oh yeah, some of the stuff I've been through. And then he like paused and he looked at me and he goes, nothing like you've been through, obviously, like you've been through way worse. And so I don't want to compare, and it's, I don't want to take that away from you, and blah, 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 blah. But that really hurt me. And I didn't tell him that at the time, but it hurt me because instead of using that opportunity to compare, not compare, but to share and bring us together under that shared experience, it was more of a like, hey, I need to, preface this. I need to
I think there's a reflexive need for that. I mean, I do that. I do exactly that same thing all the time. And I think almost everyone does, because everybody knows that there is somebody else who, whatever your horrible experience was, there is somebody else who had that +1 or that +10. And that's true for, whatever person you're imagining is like the peak one, they also are having that experience,
Absolutely. So yeah, I think, and, Dave and I, we love focusing on Afghanistan in general. We love talking about things like the book
what
that
we
you wrote.
know.
But this is also something that we enjoy focusing on a lot, is the mental health stuff and the support stuff and all that. Just to kind of get us back on track a little bit.
Real quick,
so
I actually had a follow-up question. So, and it doesn't have to be, down the mental health path, but I know that for me, my experiences in Afghanistan, and then subsequently the research I've done to kind of help paint a bigger picture, frankly, for myself. How has your reporting and your experiences embedding with these military units, and you've been across the board, you've been with multinational units, you've been with conventional forces, you've been with special operations forces. How has that shaped your view on not just kind of that global landscape, but how you look at the world, how you look at, the decisions that our country makes, frankly, throughout administrations? I can point over the last 3 or 4 administrations where it's like, that's not a good idea, or that's not the right call, or
I mean, it's certainly kind of a sobering and embittering experience about the use of military force. But it's not that I've become a pacifist or anything, but if I were to compare myself to, the 19-year-old who went to Iraq and thought like, oh, the United States is going to win the war with the surge. And it really came out of that first trip to Iraq kind of thinking that, and even came out of the second trip to Iraq thinking the United States has won the war with the surge, because that's what it looked like in 2008. And then, compare myself to today. I mean, it's a lot more jaded, and I think a lot, but part of that is just after kind of my early years of embedding was then for the book, going back in some of the same places after the U.S. military had left, going back to the Pesh when the ANA were patrolling the place, going back to Kabul toward the end of the war and talking to, I couldn't get up to Kunar anymore because ISIS-K was there, but talking to Afghans who were coming down to Kabul from there, to visit their parliamentary representatives or do business or whatever, and talking to them about their experiences of the war. I mean, that was huge. They saw it in a hugely different way in a lot of ways, as people could probably imagine and expect. And yeah, I mean, just sort of gaining an understanding of like, well, what are the inadvertent trickle down third order consequences of literally everything that the United States does in a war zone, and how do those affect people's lives just down the road? It's hard not to come away, jaded about it. I remember there's a Foreign Service officer who was on the Nuristan PRT, who actually he's a Waigali speaker. He had done his PhD field work in the 1970s in the Waigali, lived there for 2 years, learned Waigali. Probably the only American who set foot in Nuristan who speaks Waigali. and his, one of his takeaways was, he was like, the more you learn about this place, the more the more you realize that you just can't predict the consequences of any little thing that you're going to do. And and he's like, I understand that that's why the battalion commanders, couldn't, if they knew what I knew, they wouldn't be able to do anything. They'd be paralyzed. And that's not something that a battalion commander can be. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm happy that I am not someone who has to make policy decisions. I'll say that.
Yeah.
I just get to.
Yeah, and with Afghanistan, especially that region, it's the more you learn, the less you know. It's really sobering.
Yeah. No, I mean, with some of the most gratifying feedback, about the book, about The Hardest Place, has been some of from guys like you who read the book, or even more so when it's somebody who, they were a private with like no context about what they were doing for a year in Kunar and Nuristan, and they contact me saying, oh, I read this book, and boy, it doesn't seem like it was a good idea, but it sure does help me understand, why those decisions were made that were up there. But even more so, I mean, I have sometimes guys will write to me saying, hey, my time up there was not something I could ever talk to my wife about, or could ever talk to my dad about, or could ever talk to my, now college age kids about. And I gave them this book to read, and it was a discussion point. And they understand me better now. And that, that's, I think that's sort of the thing that I was most happiest about to come out of this book, of, the experience of people reading it, is if it helps them relate to their own war better, or helps other people close to them relate to their war better and to them better.
Yeah. And
it's a book that I wish I had. I know I said this already, but I wish I had that. I wish it had been written and it was available, before I had deployed.
Well, you guys, the military had to make all these screw ups in order for me to write about them. So.
Yeah, well, we talked about the time machine though, so we could have figured that piece out, I guess. When I was a company commander, I didn't deploy as a company commander, but when I was a company commander, I had lieutenants that I know at some point in their careers might. And so when we were sitting down and I would have these one-on-ones with a few of them, like there were a handful of books that I would recommend, be like, hey, you should pick this up. It's going to help paint the picture of, what it was like or what you might be walking into, et cetera, et cetera. And I got to admit, I think your book hits that short list where, if I ever end up in a conversation with somebody, be like, hey, I know you think you may think what was going on in Afghanistan, but read this book. It'll really help fill in a lot of gaps for you. And when you find yourself, or any of us find ourselves, in one of those situations in the future, you'll start looking around and say, what am I missing? Right. Mm-hmm. With the fog of war was different. Like I would argue that everything in your book that I took away from it was what I would call the fog of war. It's the stuff I couldn't see. I didn't fully understand the relationships. In self-reflection, I was absolutely leveraged from one power player to another to try to influence, local politics or local dynamics within Kunar. But I didn't know it at the time. I thought I was doing a great thing.
Yeah, and you take the lessons learned from a book like that, and like you said, you not only do you take the more what I would think of as explicit lessons learned, but a more implicit thing, like you were talking about, Dave, is like you can read a book like that and go, like what am I missing now, right? Obviously, everyone there at the time that this, the events of this book were occurring, everyone was missing key pieces of information, knowledge, wisdom about what was going on. And so, that's a constant reoccurring thing, right? It's the same thing in Vietnam. It's the same thing in Iraq. And so if you take that lesson, which is more of an implicit lesson, and go, all right, well, now I find myself in this other place, whether it be, a military conflict or anything, right? Any sort of complex environment. You go, what am I missing? Because I know I have to be missing something. When Wesley Morgan comes back and writes the book about this, this experience, what is he going to uncover that I am not tracking right now that I should be, right? And I think that is so useful.
It really was fantastic reporting. Like it's just the how deep you had to go to be able to connect dots that were oblivious to folks living and fighting it, for years at a time. I just hats off to you, sir. Phenomenal book.
Appreciate that. I mean, and of course, I mean, I was able to do this with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, many of those dots simply would have been impossible for anyone, who was in the seat trying to do the thing, to connect. So I mean, certainly a valid, good exercise always to try and, think about what you're missing. But that's not to say that, everybody was negligent because they couldn't uncover these things that were being deliberately hidden from them by Afghans who wanted to conceal it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned you have that you're working on another book right now. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the basic idea of it is, we were talking before about the tension between what conventional forces did, who were sort of the beat cops of the war on terror, and what, JSOC, Direct Action Counterterrorism Forces, Rangers, SEAL Team 6, Delta Force, SAS did, who were kind of the SWAT teams of the war on terror. And that second part of it is something that was really outside the visible spectrum for reporters, right? We can embed with any conventional unit we wanted to. We can embed with some soft, Green Berets, guys like that. But what the task force was doing, as they called it, was always just sort of something you could only glimpse out of the corner of your eye. And, you knew when they had a big success, they killed Zarqawi or they killed bin Laden. And then you knew when they really screwed something up. You were embedded with a conventional battalion that had some horror story about a house where a lot of people had been killed for no reason that was obvious to the conventional force. I tried to weave a little bit of that into the hardest place to the extent that I could. But since the book came out, and then since the war in Afghanistan ended, I think a lot of barriers have come down among those guys from that side of the fence to telling their stories. And so that's what I'm trying to do is basically, go and talk to as many guys from that community as I can, and against the backdrop of this emerging stabbed in the back narrative and against the backdrop of both the Australian SAS and the British SAS are the focus of really serious war crimes investigations in their countries over what they did kind of at the tail end of the Afghan surge at the point when everybody was very embittered with the war. Everybody in these communities felt like we're fighting kind of a fruitless catch and release. Everybody we catch gets released. What's the point of any of this? There were a lot of factors that, led toward unethical and immoral and sometimes illegal behavior. And so the big question for me is, why did this happen in some units but not others? So, for example, in the Brereton investigation, as it's called, that kind of was the big Australian government inquiry into allegations of prisoner executions by the Australian SAS. They found that, there was some really, really ugly stuff that happened and was pretty endemic in certain units of the Australian SAS at the tail end of the war, 2011, 2012. But it was not evenly distributed across the Australian Special Operations Enterprise. There are 3 Australian SAS squadrons. One of them had the vast majority of these incidents. Another one had a lot of them, and one had almost none. And then also their kind of more ranger-like element, their more conventional infantry kind of what they call the commando regiment, also had very, very few of them relative to these 2 squadrons of the SAS. So that's kind of the question I'm trying to explore is, well, so in these circumstances, when all these units, Rangers, Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, these 2 SASs, the SBS, their equivalents, are all thrown into the same kind of nighttime manhunting mission, where really they're doing, something that feels much less productive in Afghanistan than it felt like in Iraq, where you could feel like you were eating the insurgency from the inside out. Whereas in Afghanistan, I mean, you're never going to get to those top leaders. The top leaders are across the border in Pakistan. It often just felt like a much more Sisyphean task for these units. Why did some units descend into unethical, immoral, illegal behavior? And why did other units not? Why were they able to kind of keep it together, even when facing the same challenges?
That's a great premise for a book. I think there are a lot of professional lessons to be learned looking at something like that. So I think a work like that is going to be really, really important, especially as we continue this shift to kind of focus more on special operations forces and, including what we, and you're aware of this term, but what we think of as like black special operations for you got your white special operations forces, the A teams that, go and do this stuff. But then you have like the JSOC guys, which is kind of more the dark underbelly of SOF. And our national defense continues to kind of, push into that, the use of those types of forces. So knowing what sorts of factors can contribute to those sorts of things is going to be huge. Can you tell us about maybe when we should expect to be able to read that one?
Oh, it's going to be a couple years.
Okay.
It's a ways. I should say, like probably more than 3 years. It's a ways down the road.
Sure. Well, keep us updated because
It's a tough reporting project. I mean, there's it's not going to be able to be nearly as comprehensive. As the hardest place, it's going to have to be much more sort of based around sort of certain episodes. There's nowhere near the documentary evidence. I mean, the FOIA litigation that I'm involved in is just it's nothing. There's a lot. The military is not great at modern military is not great at keeping records from these wars. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Especially on the kind of the secret side of the house. There's a lot of things that you're hoping that this document just exists and just needs to be declassified, and then it turns out that it just doesn't exist.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, I even if it takes a couple years, I'm really looking forward to it.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and unless
I look
anybody,
forward to more of this podcast.
oh, thank you, I appreciate it. This has been,
Yeah.
I'm having a great time so far. I don't know about Dave, but I'm having a blast.
It's all right.
Love to see the Kunar and Nuristan veterans getting up to great things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping one day to get. I mean, a dream would be to get a couple of former soldiers on here and just.
But yeah,
I think it'd be a
that'd
fun conversation just to rehash
sure.
rehash some of those memories.
For sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So in the meantime, for anybody who hasn't picked it up yet, the book is The Hardest Place by Wesley Morgan. You can get it, I assume, anywhere books are sold.
Yeah, and if they don't have it, just tell them to order it.
Absolutely. And you can also, and I will say this, the narration in the audiobook is phenomenal. Hearing the names, hearing the place names that the personal names and the place names that I experienced in my deployments, hearing them spoken aloud again is a really, really interesting feeling. So the audiobook's great. Obviously I spent a lot of time, doing a lot of reading and highlighting. It's a really phenomenal book. So if you don't have it yet and you're interested at all in Afghanistan and our conflict there, by all means pick up the book. It's phenomenal. You will not
100%.
regret it. Yeah. All right. Well, Wesley, thanks, man. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us today and chat with us.
Thank you guys, and best of luck with this. It should be a good project.
Thanks. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
All right. Well, with that, everybody, we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much again to my co-host Dave and to Wesley Morgan, whose book you can get wherever it's sold. All right, gentlemen, thanks very much.
Absolutely.